Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome to the second in our series of Playbook Live virtual interviews. Thanks for bearing with us as we figure how we do this thing out from our various bedrooms and front rooms. Thanks for joining it. And if you want to take part in today's event, there's a Q&A function on your Zoom player, which allows you to type a question in. I'll be monitoring them as the interview goes along. And if your question's good, I'll read it out and we'll try and get you an answer. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jack Blanchard. I'm editor of Politico's London Playbook morning email briefing. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Tony Gardner, who, as I'm sure you know, was US ambassador to the EU for 3 years between 2014 and 2017. Tony was very much Barack Obama's man in Brussels. He also did some work on EU relations for Bill Clinton back in the 90s, so very much an expert on transatlantic relations, which of course has been a hugely topical issue the past few years. And so we're going to talk a lot about that this afternoon. Before we do though, Tony, and thank you very much for joining us, I want to talk about the protests that have been gripping your country for the last couple of weeks and really making headlines around the world. Everyone seems to have a view on how Donald Trump has dealt with this. What's your view?
Well, Jack, first of all, it's great to be on Playbook. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
well,
fine. Go ahead.
It's time for more and more people to be clear and speak up, as so much is at stake for the future of American democracy and the future of race relations. You know, for a couple of years, I was troubled by many things that Donald Trump shares with someone my grandparents, my Italian grandparents, fled from in 1938. Not only in terms of his language, but his grimaces and even his playbook. I hate to use that word. You know, a lot of military leaders have spoken up about how it's inappropriate to use the military in these situations. And I would certainly agree. I also agree it's very inappropriate to be using religion and churches as a political prop in these situations. And of course, very disappointing, very dispiriting to have a president of the United States who is openly fomenting, inciting racial divisions in order to energize part of his base. That's obviously extremely disappointing. So much is at stake here. You know, Obama used to say, the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. I think that was a phrase that Martin Luther King used. Unfortunately, we're discovering that that arc is very long. And those of us, including me, who thought that the election of Barack Obama signaled a definitive turn for improved race relations have been proven, you know, in fact, a bit naive. It's going to take a very long time. But so much is at stake, Jack, in terms of what we decide as a people in November of this year for our presidential elections. And that's one reason why I'm supporting from day one Joe Biden's candidacy is that he would try to heal the country rather than to divide it.
How shocking was it to see a figure like General James Notley come out and speak about his former boss and the President of the United States in the way that he did at the end of last week?
Well, you know, I'm glad that these people are speaking up, but I'll be very honest here and very diplomatic. You know, I don't welcome those statements in the sense that those people served this president. And to me, quite bluntly, they are accomplices. They are accomplices. So when you choose to work for this kind of administration who showed its true colors very early on, at some point you abet the policies, even if afterwards you decide that they're terrible, the man you were serving is a terrible person. So while I'm glad they're saying what they're saying, it comes too late. You know, and I have friends who decided to serve at high levels of this administration, something I could never have imagined doing myself for whatever reason. Because there are moments in life, and we're facing such a moment right now, where we have to decide ethically what is the appropriate course of action to take. And regardless of the title one gets or the prestige one gets by serving at a high level US government, I think there comes a moment when you say, I cannot be part of this. And I hope we've reached that moment. Unfortunately, it's taken 3 years.
We've seen big protests in America over racial inequalities before. Is this different? Does this feel different to you?
Well, I think the size, the scope feels different to me. You know, I was too young. You know, in 1968, I was only 5 years old, so I don't really have memories of that. I've just seen them, clips from the television. I feel that, you know, when we had the student demonstrations in all over the country, including university campuses. My father, who was a professor at Columbia, used to recount to me in detail what it was like. You know, when universities were being shut down, you had some violent clashes with police. It feels like that, but I've never seen anything in my lifetime.
And you know, this comes on the back after 8 years of a Democrat president, America's first black president. Could President Obama have done more in retrospect to address some of these issues that people are now so angry about?
Well, I think his record on race relations is terrific. But, you know, as I said, we underestimated that this is not by any means a voyage that's over. You know, our country is still on a long voyage. One of my proudest moments, Jack, when I was ambassador to the EU, is showing a film in Brussels. And many people thought it was a curious choice. The film was Selma, about the March on Selma, you know, the civil rights movement. It's a choice because it's a pretty critical movie, and it shows what we went through as a country back then. This was a pretty dark chapter, but, you know, I look back on that and I said, that was the right movie. And I was proud to show that movie because I thought, you know, the United States is hopefully has learned some lesson, can look itself in the mirror and then redress its path, go back to the straight path. It's going to take a while, but we have to learn the lessons from the past.
Mm-hmm. And do you remain optimistic about the country?
Well, yes, and that's an important point. So, and I should have said that in my opening statement. I am optimistic in the sense that I have faith in the American people. I really do, to make the right choice. I have faith in our institutions, our media, and our judiciary, which both of which are holding up well under significant pressure. But we have to make the right choice in November. It means that people have to go out and vote. Turnout is going to be important. So some of these minorities, and I don't want to talk about African Americans, but others who feel put upon, aggrieved, and quite correctly so, need to exercise their democratic right to vote. That's the only way we're going to get a change in November. So I'm going to do everything I can to make sure we get a change in November.
Okay, well, let's talk about I want to talk about the election in a minute. Let's talk a little bit about transatlantic relationship under Donald Trump, because obviously that's been a hugely important issue over on this side of the pond. We had some news on Friday that President Trump plans to reduce the US military presence in Germany by nearly 30%. This seems to come completely out of the blue. Nobody seemed to be aware that this was coming. What's your response to that?
Makes no sense. You know, it's a gift to Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump's good friend. This is another indication of how he embraces autocrats and enemies of our country. We should be holding firm. It serves not only the defense of Europe and Germany, but our own purposes, right? Because those bases are incredibly important also for the projection of our influence and our power on Europe, the Middle East, and even beyond. So it makes no sense whatsoever. This is a political act. It's not a military. There's no military strategy behind it. And I think it's been criticized by many military former officials.
What do you think the thinking is politically then? You know, what's Donald Trump trying to say here or do here?
Well, he's angry. He's been angry at Angela Merkel for many years, for many reasons. She's very forthright, outspoken in terms of defense of certain values that we used to share. He's angry because of, I guess, the trade deficit and German cars being an important part of that. He's probably annoyed at her because, unlike some of the European leaders, she has not gone out of her way to curry favor with him, which I think, frankly, was the right thing to do, because those who tried that strategy failed. So, he's been annoyed with Angela Merkel for a long time.
Will it impress some of his supporters in America to see him doing this? Do they care about US military bases in Germany?
Well, it plays into the theme that burden sharing, Europeans are not doing enough. And, they're not doing enough. I mean, I would agree with that. That's not a new theme. It's going on for decades. But here I would put a slightly different spin on this. I would agree with that thesis, but burden sharing has to be seen in a much wider lens. It's not just military burden sharing where Europeans, including Germany, is not doing enough, but it's also burden sharing on climate. It's burden sharing on migration. It's burden sharing and keeping, this turbulent neighborhood around, in the Mediterranean stable, where Europeans are actually doing rather well, and the United States often isn't doing as much. So it is a little bit unfair to say that the only thing that counts is how much money you spend on defense. Numbers are going up, by the way, and partly because of Barack Obama's pressure as well.
They're going up, but they're going up pretty slowly. And it does feel like Donald Trump has changed the conversation on this in quite a dramatic way. And he would probably say is an effective way. Isn't there some sense in the way he's approached this from a purely American perspective?
Well, yeah, the numbers have been going up, but it's not just due to his, smashing of a lot of, porcelain. Pressure has been building up. And it's not just, by the way, not just the amount of money that needs to go up. It's the way it's spent. That is often not talked about as much. Some countries, I often talk about Belgium here. I hate to pick on Belgium, but Belgium spends a large majority of the money it spends, which is about 1% of its GDP, which is on defense. And of that, I think around 70%, I believe, is on non-combat relevant things such as salaries and pensions. That is a huge issue. Europe not only spends too little, it doesn't spend enough on the right things. So yeah, I give Donald Trump some credit, but I just don't like his technique.
Fair enough. Does he think he sort of sees the EU as his enemy in a geopolitical sense?
Well, this would take so long to answer that question, Jack. This is the most absurd thing for me of the many list of absurdities of this administration to consider the EU as an enemy. He said it's worse than China, but smaller. That's a direct quote, right? We had an ambassador, my successor, who went around criticizing the EU. But this is based on gross caricatures and a lack of understanding of what the EU does. It's an essential partner of the United States in many, many areas. Sure, we have differences too. And I've written about them at length, including the recent book, where we have worked with them successfully on sanctions. That's to our interest. We worked with them on climate change in the days we believe in climate change, foreign aid, humanitarian assistance, on law enforcement cooperation. The list goes on. So the idea that the EU is somehow our enemy is crazy. Where I think the Trump train has jumped the tracks so dramatically, literally, after 70 years of partisan U.S. foreign policy toward the EU, supporting European integration. And the way is this. The view is that we don't need the EU to deal with China and WTO reform. It's at best an irrelevance, right? At best. That's fundamentally misguided. We are natural partners with the EU to reform the WTO and deal with unfair Chinese competition. We should be sitting down with them right now. So to me, it's just bizarre.
Is there a sense maybe that not enough has been done to sort of make the case for America having a muscular presence in Europe and in NATO, on the home front? Maybe people have sort of lost sight of why all this was so important in the first place, and it allows leaders to create divisions where there never were before.
That's a good point. I remember raising this issue, discussing this when I was at a big part of what diplomats should be doing, State Department should be doing, is not only communicating outward to our host countries, but also communicating to our own public as to what on earth diplomats do. Why the EU is important, why NATO is important, why are we there, why are we spending all this money? Because indeed, there is this perception out there that we are gifting all of this aid, this assistance to foreign countries. It doesn't do us any good, but it's fundamentally wrong. It supports our own interests. And the public perception sometimes is so skewed. In poll after poll that asks the American public, how much do we spend on foreign aid as a percentage of our budget? Typically, there's a response to something like 20%, which of course is well below 1%, well below 1%. Much less than what European countries do on foreign aid. But the perception is out there that we're somehow, throwing dollars around for others' benefit without using it ourselves.
I've got a question I'm going to take from Henk-Jan Ormel. Is blaming President Trump not also saying something about the US democratic system, that one man can have such a tremendous influence on all of these things we're talking about, where are the checks and balances on his power? Have they been effective, the famous system of checks and balances?
Well, I mentioned that before. I think, so far, fingers crossed, they have been effective. So look, I am, bottom line, I am hopeful, and I believe in our system of government and the genius of our founding fathers, really, really. And anyone who is not convinced of that should read the Federalist Papers, by the way, where all these issues are laid down in detail by our founding fathers, right? So our court system has put checks on the power of the presidency. Our media has been putting checks, and often been at great cost to themselves and to their networks or their papers. So that has worked. So that is all good news. But if he wins a second term, then I do worry about the power of the president to make appointments, the federal bench and the Supreme Court. Let's not forget the Supreme Court, where he could decisively swing the power of the judiciary for potentially generations.
How much damage has been done to the transatlantic relationship in the last 3.5 years of President Trump taking a very different approach to American presidents we've seen before?
Jack, it's depressing. Honestly, it's depressing. When I rode off into the sunset, so to speak, my last day in office, I was worried, but I had no idea how crazy this is. And, if one had to compare the policy of this administration toward Europe to the one that existed previously under Obama, you just have to look at two speeches, right? The one speech was given by Secretary of State Pompeo, and it was hosted in Brussels by the German Marshall Fund, and it was in the same venue, which is the Conseil Noble in Brussels, as a speech 2 years prior given by John Kerry. The two visions are so dramatically different. They are polar opposites. I think, the Pompeo speech was frankly the most ignorant speech I've ever read, certainly by a Secretary of State. It was based on misconceptions, gross miscaricatures of the EU and Europe. It misrepresented what the United States foreign policy has been for a long time and what it should be, i.e. the importance and the relevance of multilateralism, not as an encroachment on our own sovereignty, but is something that actually makes us more secure and more prosperous, right? And you compare that to what John Kerry was saying, and it really is, it captures everything. So a lot of damage has been done. But look, the good news is a lot of it, I think, can be corrected. And that's one of the reasons why I hope Joe Biden gets elected. A lot of it can be corrected. We go back to participating as a respected leader in the world. I still believe in American leadership, not because the U.S. has all the answers. God knows we don't. So the last 3 years have shown that. But the world does need American leadership. There is no alternative.
Yeah, I'm sure you still speak to people in Brussels all the time in your diplomatic circles. Do you think the people that matter see this change in the relationship as a brief aberration, or as a genuine geopolitical change in the way that America and Europe will view each other going forward?
Well, some things have changed, no doubt, and things, we can't pretend that we can wind the clock back to where it was before Trump won, because he has brilliantly tapped into sources of frustration that were there but were ignored, about globalization, multilateralism, about stagnation, middle class income and wages and so forth, and all of those things are legitimate. So we can't go back to business as usual. And one of the great challenges will be for, I hope, the Biden administration to say, well, where can we act to fix things, but actually go about things in a different way? And I'm involved on the trade front. I think there are things we can do that will be respectful of people's fears, and will also take into account what is doable, because we can't go back to these ambitious trade deals, particularly in a post-COVID world, right? But we'll have to go back to being a player in the multilateral system. Bringing the WTO down to the ground doesn't serve our purpose whatsoever. The rule of the biggest guy in the jungle wins is a game where everyone will lose.
On talking about trade, you say we can't go back to these big ambitious trade deals. That must be difficult for you to say that, having spent so much time involved in the TTIP negotiations. Must have dominated much of your time in office there, and then to see that fall by the wayside. Are you saying now that deals like that are never coming back?
Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, it was my biggest regret. I spent about TTIP on strategy communication. It was important not only economically, but even, I would argue, even more so politically, and we failed. But we did make some progress, and I think there are bits of it that we can actually implement. I've made some proposals. I actually think we should seriously consider eliminating all tariffs on industrial goods trade. But it can't be alone, because legitimately there are some important interests in the United States, particularly our exports, agricultural, who want to see some important progress on sanitary and phytosanitary provisions. But the short answer is we need to scale down our ambitions. We fought a lot of big bloody battles during TTIP that weren't necessary. And, investor-state dispute settlement was just one of them. I mean, that was an unnecessary battle. And it diverted our attention from things that we could get done.
But what makes you say that they in general terms, these big deals are a thing of the past? Like, why has the world changed to say you can't do that anymore?
Well, if anything, conditions have become even more difficult. Look, in 2015, I was amazed. I was taken aback that not only just the Germans, the Austrians, the Luxembourgers, but even the Dutch, even parts of the UK, showed great deal of skepticism, and the French, by the way, skepticism about big, ambitious trade deals that were perceived by many as threatening to their way of life, to their lifestyles, their culture, and their food, and so forth. And today, with all the job losses, I think it's going to be even more difficult. People are more frightened. What's more natural, Jack, than, at a time of crisis for people to lift the drawbridge, and to retreat within their, citadels, and to say, well, supply chains have gotten out of hand. We need to make everything at home. We need to be more autarkic, global trade is a threat. That would be a terrible lesson to learn from this crisis, is that we do away with all the benefits, the efficiencies of global supply chains and what we've built since the Second World War. So we're going to have to fight for that. But in addition to fighting for that, we're going to have to be ruthlessly focused on what we can actually get done. I mean, look, CETA had such a hard time, right? And other agreements that the EU has tried to sign have had a hard time, including the Netherlands, the biggest proponent of free trade. So we need to be very clear-minded.
And do you see those same sort of skeptical feelings about, big global free trade policies within your own Democrat Party as well now? Some of the younger left taking a much more protectionist approach than we might have seen before.
That's a good point. I mean, look, I'm not sure that Bernie Sanders has ever seen a trade agreement he likes, or he would ever be capable of seeing a free trade agreement he likes. Elizabeth Warren, I'm not sure she'd fall in love with any free trade agreement. So yeah, we have our own issues within our own party. But what's really been interesting is that the Republican Party, that, as you know, traditionally has been the party of free trade, is somehow, morphed into an unrecognizable party. It was also the party that believed in deficits were dangerous. They suddenly morphed into a party that doesn't think the deficits matter anymore. But yes, we have an issue within our own party, which is why we're going to have to prioritize. I think a US-EU free trade deal is actually one of the few that can get done, because we share a lot of the same values in terms of protecting the environment, protecting labor, protecting intellectual property rights. And you can't say that about many areas of the world.
Okay, so something much smaller than TTIP, much less ambitious, could still be a possibility, it sounds like.
I hope so. I think so.
And a question from Caroline Bialak, who's asking about the future of trade relations. Well, we've talked about that. She says, will the EU and US find a negotiated solution to the Airbus-Boeing case, or will that trade war continue? And is that something that could continue under Biden, do you think, if he was president?
Well, so I have kind of a short list of things I would like to see done in the first 6 months of a Biden administration. I mentioned one of them. So you have a deal to eliminate tariffs on industrial goods trade. I would like to see us sit down right away and to settle this Boeing Airbus dispute. It's gone on for far too long, and in my view, among the few constituencies that benefit from this are the Chinese, who are busily building a third competitor. It makes no sense. Both sides, and I don't want to get into the details of this because I have to be a little careful, but both sides have engaged in some activities that have been contrary to, or been judged by the WTOs and contrary to WTO rules. We should certainly aim to fix this dispute.
Walking into this difficult protectionist environment, appears the United Kingdom, which is just left the EU and is now planning big free trade deals with all the countries in the world, we're told. How do you assess Britain's prospects of achieving first some sort of decent trade deal with the EU over the next, what do we got, 6 months? How do you think that's going to go?
Yeah, look, I've followed this pretty closely. My view is that there is a rather significant chance that this government will take the UK out of the EU without a deal, for a lot of reasons which most of you will be intimately acquainted with. But knowing some members of this administration in London, my sense is they see a golden opportunity to hide all of the damage from Brexit into the long grass of COVID, and said, we should take that opportunity. There are others who are saying, look, Brexit, even a hard Brexit, was the glue that kept the party together. We can't veer from that. They're also negotiating a vision of a future agreement which is light years away from what the EU's vision of negotiated partnership would be, and often actually is enshrined in many ways in the political declaration. And I think the UK government in some instances veered away from that. So I'm not very optimistic. I don't see in the infrastructure being built to deal with even a hard Brexit. So I think it's going to be a difficult period for the UK in the first few months. But the country has some advantages which will persist afterwards. So I'm not gloomy about the future of the United Kingdom.
And in a practical sense, you've been obviously very close to these big trade negotiations. How difficult is it, the thing that Britain is trying to do right now, which is come from a standing start, having not negotiated any trade deals at all for, what's it been, 40 years or something, to negotiating one with the EU and with the US at the same time, with no experience of doing that? Is that, is this an impossible challenge, or is this actually, overblown as something that we should be able to do?
Well, it's a challenge, but the government has certainly taken steps to rectify the fact that for many years they didn't need to have any trade negotiators because the EU was the negotiator on behalf of the UK. So they've hired a lot of terrific people, and both inside and outside of government, to advise them. It's doable, but one should be realistic about what is achievable. And there are trade-offs. I mean, this is the key point for me. There are trade-offs in all of these decisions. There were trade-offs in Brexit, which in my view were never fully explained to the British people, but there are also trade-offs in the US, UK, and the UK-EU free trade agreements, and trade-offs in terms of how far the UK will diverge from EU regulations, and that has an impact on the kind of deal that the UK will get with the United States. So the two things are intimately intertwined, and it's going to be very difficult for the US to make significant progress with the UK on a free trade deal until it's quite clearer what the UK-EU final deal will be.
I want to finish with talking about the forthcoming US elections, which are now less than 5 months to go. You're a big Biden supporter. Are you actually involved in his campaign, Tony? Are you taking on some sort of role, or are you just, discussing in the background?
Well, I'm not a spokesman, so let me make that absolutely clear. In no way am I a spokesman for the campaign. But I joined on day one, and yes, so I'm participating in some of the strategy development on, not surprisingly, on Europe and on trade, along with a lot of other people, as you can imagine, which will be well known to, I think, a lot of people. So, work is going on in the background, so significant work is going on.
Okay, good. So that's clear. What extent do you think the outcome in November is going to be, a reaction to these two big crises that have gripped America this year, completely out of nowhere? No one saw 2020 panning out the way it has so far. Are they going? Is a coronavirus and these Black Lives Matter protests going to be the crucial things that now decide this election?
Well, trust was always going to be on the ballot. Always is. People ask themselves, well, who do I really like? Who do I trust? And the key killer question is always, is the country going in the right direction? And the economy, has been very important. The stock market has gone down, now back up. But the killer question is, do I really trust the person in the White House to steer the country in the right direction? And that's why I think Joe Biden has been correct to identify the main theme of the campaign is a battle for the soul of the country. That's what we're talking about. And I think more and more people are looking for a leader who has empathy, who has an ability to heal to the extent that we can be healed, and I think we still can. So yes, the short answer is these two events will have, I think, a major impact.
I'm going to ask a couple of questions from the Q&A here about Trump's presidency. Ian Riley asks, Trump was elected by voters who've been disadvantaged by several decades of globalization. He says there'd been plenty of time to address that, but that would require some redistribution of wealth that would take from the rich. And he asks, is the US government even in a position to do that? Has it been captured by lobbyists, by money? You know, is the US prepared to make fundamental changes, I guess, that would actually, you know, help the people that have put Trump in power?
Look, inequality in the United States is not a new issue, but everyone's seen the graphs. It's become an increasingly difficult and pressing issue in terms of the percentage of wealth that's now accumulated in the hands of the top 1%, 0.1%, top 10%, and so forth. It's pretty shocking if you've seen those figures. Something is wrong, and the something is that our system, our laws are skewed in the advantage of the very well off. And you know, this latest tax cut that was implemented by Donald Trump, you know, all of the analysis I've seen shows that it has dramatically benefited the very, very well off. All the tax advantages as well, in terms of both capital gains and the use of debt and so forth, I think have done the same. So we really need to address this underlying source of inequality and middle income wage stagnation, which has been a huge, not a new issue, but a huge issue. And on trade, I would be the first to say we have not done enough. You know, we've had this system of free trade adjustment assistance, which was there to cushion the blow for those who suffer the consequences of globalization and free trade, and it's not worked. Everyone would say that. We need to make it work, and Europe needs to make its system work better.
And you'll know that for a lot of young Democrats, Joe Biden is quite a disappointing choice in candidate. They wanted someone more radical in their approach than him. Are you sure he's the progressive force that America needs to change?
Look, I'm convinced that he's the right person. I worked with him quite a bit. I've known him for a long time. I know a lot of members of his team. He has the qualities that we need. I mentioned one of them, empathy. But more than that, he has the capacity to connect with blue-collar voters. You know, he's done that all his life. It's not something he discovered yesterday. You know, for decades, he has been doing this and standing up for race relations and the interests of the middle class. You know, a lot of young people will feel that he wasn't the right choice, but, you know, it's interesting, you know, Bernie Sanders wasn't exactly a young, new face either. I think he was unelectable. And I would remind those who were disappointed that the first job is to make sure your candidate wins. Because if Donald Trump wins the second term, we're in big trouble. I don't believe that Bernie Sanders could have won. I don't believe in Elizabeth Warren, even though I have great respect for her. You know, she's just a terrific mind. I don't think she could have won. I don't think Kamala Harris should have won. So, you know, we should put all of those concerns aside and said, is this a man who can win? And I've believed ever since he announced, even during the dark days in November, December, Jack, that he could win. And I think he's going to win.
Where does it leave America if he doesn't win? What does the world look like with a second term President Trump?
I'd be worried. I really would be very worried. I'd be worried for the country, and I'd be worried for the planet. You know, there's a joke that the world should be able to vote in U.S. elections, because we don't only, you know, have an impact on ourselves when we vote. The world feels the consequences. But of course, that's not going to happen. I'd worried for our planet. You know, we've lost 3, soon 4 years in terms of what we could do to make sure the Paris climate change accords are implemented. And let's remember, those accords were just a first step. They were just a first step. You know, it wasn't going to be enough to get us to 2 degrees warming from pre-industrial times. And now we've just lost 4 years. So we're going to have to be even work harder to get ourselves out of the hole. That's just one example. The world is going to look like even worse, more unstable place. And forget, I haven't even mentioned the image of the United States has gone to hell. It's literally gone to hell. No one trusts us anymore. We can't preach or even talk about things like good governance and anti-corruption or democracy, things like that. In fact, we've embraced countries even within Europe who don't believe in those principles of judicial independence and media freedom. We're a laughingstock. Some countries like us, but our ability to exercise leadership with another 4 years of Donald Trump will be severely damaged.
Okay, and my last question, even if he doesn't win, even if this is a one-term president and America goes back to something that looks like normal to the rest of us afterwards, the forces that put Donald Trump in power and creating these huge divisions we're seeing, they're still there, right? Those people still feel like that. And presumably someone else is going to come along and try and use some of the same sort of tricks that he's used to put himself in power and stir those same tensions. How does America heal from this moment?
That's a very, very tough question. Of course, those people are not going to disappear. And especially, Donald Trump will not ride off into the sunset quietly. He will continue to use his ability through social media and otherwise to divide and antagonize and get his base out and to say, through conspiracy theories or race baiting and so forth. Sure, it's going to be a very, very long journey. But the only way we can do this is to at least try to, where we can, work with the Republican Party and to put it into this bitter era of division. But I'm not naive. If we don't win the Senate, it could be a very turbulent period.
Okay. All right. Well, lots to think about. Tony, thank you for joining us. We're going to try something new now for those of you watching. We're going to have a sort of a Zoom networking event straight after this interview, starting now. You'll get sent a separate link through your Zoom player where you can come and join myself and Tony and also my editor, Kate Day, will be joining us too. If you click the link, you'll come on into that meeting. You'll be muted, but you'll be there in video person to speak to us, and we'll take a few more questions there. All you have to do is click the raise hand button on your Zoom player, which will pop up as an option when you come through to that room, and then you can ask questions to me, you can ask questions to Tony, and hopefully we'll have a bit more of an informal chat for those of you that want to give it a try. So it's the first time we've done it. Bear with us if it's a little bit chaotic, but hopefully it'll be a nice chance for you to actually come and speak to us direct. For those of you that aren't going to do that, thank you very much for watching. Thank you to Tony for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you hopefully for our next Playbook virtual interview, which is with Jeremy Hunt, the former Health Secretary, later this month. Thanks very much for joining. Cheers.